Welcome to The Breakdown with Brodkorb and Becky, a weekly podcast that breaks down politics, policy, and current affairs. I'm Michael Brodkorb. Becky Scherr is off on maternity leave, so you're stuck with just me this week, but I promise I've got another fantastic episode lined up. I'm thrilled to be joined today by Anna Mathews, the former executive director of the Republican Party in Minnesota. Anna has played a key role behind the scenes in shaping the party's strategy, messaging, and operations during a pivotal time for Republicans in the state. With a sharp political mind and years of campaign and organizational experience, Anna brings a deep understanding of Minnesota's shifting political dynamics, the internal challenges facing the GOP, and what it takes to run a modern political operation in an increasingly divided landscape. Today, Anna joins us to talk about her time at the helm of the Minnesota GOP, the future of the party under the new leadership, and her take on the path forward for Republicans heading into the 2026 elections. Thank you for being here, Anna, and to our listeners, and I hope you enjoy the show. I am excited to be joined today by Anna Mathews, who is well known in Republican circles in this state and in parts of the country. She's a Republican strategist, staffer, politico extraordinaire. Anna, thank you so much for coming back to the podcast today.
Thanks for having me, Michael. Good to see you.
Remind our listeners a little bit of your origin story of how you got into politics and how you ended up being on the podcast today.
Yeah, I got into politics when I was in college. I joined the college Republicans. I'd always been conservative leaning, but not necessarily political. So joined the college Republicans, and through that just ended up having a couple of cool different internship experiences in Minnesota and in Kansas. And then after college, my first real political job was working for Emmer on his campaign. So I was there for a couple of years.
Congressman Emmer to our listeners.
Congressman Whip Emmer, I guess, to your listeners. Worked for him for a few years, and then I went down to Kansas City and ran a congressional race down there in the 2022 cycle. And then the following cycle, I was the ED at the MN GOP. So lots of different campaign experience and lots of grassroots fields, things like that. So fun, very fun.
Do you like the official side of a congressional office more than the campaign side? Which side is more of your cup of tea?
I like the campaign side. I think it's more fun. I think it's more fast-paced. I think that you see progress a lot more quickly. You hold your fate in your own hands a lot more than I think that you do on the policy side. And you just get to work with a lot more people. You get to meet a lot more people. It's just more fun. I just think the campaign side is much more fun.
Yeah, I never worked. Becky, my co-host, who is celebrating and she of course had a new baby, so she's off for the next few weeks. Again, want to remind our listeners that one of my goals of every interview is not to break this podcast while she's gone, so there's an opportunity for her to come back, and let's hope that we can accomplish that today. But one thing I always remind our listeners is that Becky worked in Congress, and she worked in Washington and worked on the congressional side, which was an opportunity I never had. I turned down an opportunity to go to D.C. to work, but that's something that I always would have liked that opportunity, and so I'm always a little bit in awe and show a little deference to people that have that congressional experience, which I never have. If I lived in D.C., I would be on my fourth marriage. I wouldn't probably know my kids. Fifth heart attack. I would probably weigh 400 pounds because I just love everything about D.C. It is just such a great town. I'm glad I didn't work out. From a health perspective, I'm glad I never went to D.C., but I'm envious of those who had that congressional experience.
Yeah, I always have to tell people who don't work in politics that the campaign side is really almost a different industry than the policy side, right? They're two totally different tracks. And unless you win a campaign and kind of jump into a chief of staff role or something, I think that they're just very different. And the people who work in both of those tracks are very different too. And I happen to think that the people on the campaign side are just a lot more fun, a lot more entrepreneurial. It's a lot more fast-paced. People are a little bit quirkier, more out of the box. Whereas you get to DC, I think that the policy wonks definitely have their reputation. So I've stuck on the campaign side for now. Not to say that'll never change, but for now, that's what it is.
As I said to our listeners a year ago, my family went on a field trip. My kids had a couple field trips to DC last year, and we went as a family. And I told my children that if I lived in D.C., I would be like that fat little German kid in Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory, just always having my hand in the chocolate river. Everything about it. It's almost overwhelming for someone like me because there's history and politics on every corner. Oh,
Yeah.
there's the EPA building. Let's get excited about the EPA building. Oh, that was a Richard Nixon, with Republican Richard Nixon started the EPA, and then there's always something going on. And I'm very in awe of your experience on the official side, but also on the campaign side, which is why you're here today. There has been a little bit of news in the last few months about some internal dynamics inside the Republican Party of Minnesota about various factions that exist. And you previously worked under Chairman Han as executive director. And one of the reasons I wanted to have you on today was to give your perspective on this internal fighting that's going on, because it's really taken off. And one of the things I consistently have said about the previous chair and with you is that you and Chairman Han, I thought, were a very kind of steady hand on the till in terms of balancing the kind of internal fighting that's always going on inside a political party. There are various factions inside the party, but this is exacerbated to the point where I think the party is simply in a non-functioning position. I'd like to get your perspective on the current kind of standoff and how you, when you were executive director, dealt with these types of issues.
Yeah, I think the first thing to think about is just what is the job of the party? And then what are the goals for Republicans for any given cycle in a year? Because obviously we're in a blue state. That doesn't mean that we'll never win or that we should set low goals. But there are a lot of other goals that are along the path instead of simply just getting a W on a statewide race. And I think that when you look at that as your only goal and that's the be all end all, and we're constantly coming up short on that, it's going to feed a lot of just like disgruntledness, if I can make up that word, and just a lot of discontent, angst, apathy, anger, frustration, all of that type of stuff. And so I think it's really important to set out clear goals, because again, just because you win or lose a statewide race, that is not necessarily reflective of the effort and the progress that has gone in. Again, not saying it's not important, but there's a lot more to it. So I think that what we've seen is that Republicans have been losing for so long, and there has not been a definition of what some of these other goals or some of these other marks of progress could be. And then people just feel frustrated and they feel like nothing is happening. Everything sucks. Everything is terrible. We're constantly losing. We're constantly the underdog. Oh, and whose fault is it? Boom, the parties. Whose fault is it? This random elected official. Like literally the lowest hanging fruit that day, you just pick it and you just blame that person. And so because there is a lot of misunderstanding and there is a lot of angst and there is a lot of emotion going on, and also too, there is a lot of misunderstanding of how politics works and how the party works and just how the industry works and what's feasible. And I say that not to like say that other people are dumb. I say that as somebody who has worked in politics, when every single day I learn something new. Every time I get a job in politics, I've always thought, oh yeah, I can do this job. I'll know like most of it, or I'll know like enough to be able to do this job well. And every single day I learn something new. And that's coming from somebody who works in it. So if you don't work in it, if you're not experiencing these things, if you're not learning and having an open mind and looking into how stuff works, and all that you're doing is watching from the outside, you're going to be even more frustrated because you're just not going to see this progress. So you have this underlying current of frustration, we'll call it, as I just described. And that really opens the door for an organization like Action for Liberty to come in and just capitalize on that and basically grift off of the frustration and make money off of the frustration. And I think that in the simplest terms, that's all that it is. It's people who are exploiting the misunderstanding. They're exploiting the lack of knowledge. They're exploiting the fact that we're in a blue state and it is very difficult for us to win here. And it has been for a very long time. And they just, in a way, like it's almost, I hate to say this, it's almost a genius that they just come in and they've figured out how to make money off of this very small group of people that's very frustrated with what's going on. And I think that what David and I tried to do when I had that job was give accomplishable goals and update people on progress and show them too how they can actually make a difference. And that's one of the things that I actually really have loved about working in politics, is that my job has allowed me a position where I can help other people see how they can make a difference or make their voice or their efforts or their time more effective. And I don't know if you get this question a lot, but people always say, oh, working in politics, that must be so depressing. Aren't you just discouraged all the time? And it's no, I'm actually the opposite of discouraged because I know what can make a difference and I know the most effective way to do that. And I've seen things turn around and I've seen things change, whether that's winning a school board race, whether that's winning a House seat, winning a difficult primary, right? Like I do see so much hope for us, but you have to be willing and able to point people in that direction. And I think the first part of that is, yes, I get that you're frustrated about this. It is really maddening when we've been losing for a long time. Here are some productive ways to fix that instead of just staying in this angst all the time and looking for somebody to blame.
Is there a role in politics for a group like Action for Liberty?
If you want to make money, yeah, it's great. But in terms of does this actually help move the ball down the field? I don't think so. No, I think that if you actually had a group doing actions, like Action for Liberty purports, like what's their motto? It's like local action for lasting liberty. They don't really do much. They're not out there organizing door knocks. They're not out there recruiting election judges. They're not out there doing any sort of actionable item to move the ball down the field. It's literally just they have their podcast, they have their blog, they write their fundraising emails, they protest a lot of stuff. They have, on the very rare occasion, like maybe half a dozen times in the past decade, organized these kind of local action type things, but that's not their bread and butter, right? Their bread and butter is just this alarmism, pointing the finger, the blame game, inflammation, infatuation. It's just a mess. No, I don't think that there's a productive place for them within the ecosystem if all that you're going to do is wake up every day and find a new person to hate on. That does not move the ball down the field.
One of the dynamics that has been set up here is that Action for Liberty has targeted the 4 incumbent members of Congress that we have: Congressman Emmer, Congresswoman Fischbach, Congressman Stauber, and Congressman Fidstead. Now, Congressman Emmer seems to get labeled by Action for Liberty as the ringleader in all of these efforts to stand on the throats of the grassroots. From your perspective as executive director, when you were there, and then your knowledge having worked for him, how can you quantify how helpful, let's start with Tom Emmer, has been to the overall Republican effort in this state?
Incredibly,
Correct.
not only just in terms of dollars, and I know people in the grassroots, like a lot of them, they don't want to hear about money, but money is incredibly important to politics. Money is important to any endeavor that you're going to partake in. So Emmer has not only been incredibly helpful financially, but even when I worked for Emmer, he was incredibly helpful to down ticket candidates. He was incredibly helpful to his BPOUs. That's another thing that I think that needs to come into this conversation. Minnesota has 120 BPOUs. We have 120 local party units and 8 congressional units. So that's 128 separate units. And there are so many good people in the grassroots. There are so many people that sit on the boards of those units. And overall, I'd say most of them, like the vast majority, they want to make a difference. They want their time to be used well. They want to be effective. And they're looking for tips, advice, funding, guidance, connections to vendors, just different things to mobilize their efforts and attract more people. And when you have somebody like Emmer and you have staffers who are willing to help in those efforts, you can get this really beautiful synergy going between somebody who's supposed to be really swampy, but who's actually there to be a resource for down ticket candidates. And obviously there are FEC regulations and things like that, right? So that all comes into play. But somebody just be organizing the top of the congressional district to trickle down to representatives and state Senate level, and then down to school boards, commissioners, park board, all of that type of stuff. So it's very frustrating to me when I hear people just bashing any elected official, Emmer or otherwise, because in all, it behooves them when Republicans succeed, right? It's not when Tom Emmer has a success, it's just all Tom Emmers and he can just keep it to himself and he just looks good, right? A rising tide lifts all ships. And I don't think that the grifty groups understand that one bit.
Push back if you think I'm wrong on something here, which is I think there's always a place for activists to judge the kind of the scorecard. And that's one of the things that the endorsement process does. You look at the elected representatives, how they vote, engage based on that endorsement that we have here. But what frustrates me is that, and I want to get to where I think this kind of started in recent era, but what frustrates me is that the criticism that is lobbied at Congressman Emmer, Majority Whip Emmer, and the other members of the congressional delegation is not just about votes. It's not about individual votes. It's about their entire leadership as a brand and the power and sway that they have.
Yeah.
And so my point is, I don't think that I would just say this to you. If I was a party officer, if I was the chair, and I previously served as the deputy chair of the party, I would love, from a party perspective, to have 4 Republican members of Congress who were out there fighting the good fight, like these 4 members of Congress are. And I would want to have a healthy relationship with the 4 members of Congress and the state party and help facilitate a positive relationship. Why do you think that in that dynamic that it seems that the party has decided to align with Action for Liberty rather than 4 members of Congress who I would argue are, that just from the transactional aspect of politics, independent of the leadership and other personas they have in putting themselves out there and waving the flag of the Republicans, why would the party align more with Action for Liberty than these members of Congress?
I think it's always easier to just take shots at people versus actually make lasting change. So on any given day, if I'm going to get up and I'm going to try to, like when I was ED, improve the party, that's hard. Like, it's not easy. There were a lot of uphill battles. There were a lot of things that we had to do that a lot of people didn't like. And it would have been so much easier for me to get up every single day and just decide who to hate on and decide who to bash and decide to just make it a criticism fest instead of actually working to make changes. Because when you work to make changes, sometimes you succeed and sometimes you don't. And even when you do succeed, there are always going to be people who aren't happy with it. And so with the party, you're looking at a very small pool of people. You're looking at roughly 350 state central delegates who you essentially report to. You're looking at a board of 15 people that I guess you report to before state central. And then you're looking at a statewide state convention delegate pool of about 2,200 people. And I think that so frequently at the party, it's easy to get caught up in what those small groups of people are thinking and whether or not you're going to get reelected and whether or not they're happy with your leadership, than to actually look at the bigger picture and say, okay, what do we need to do today to move the ball down the field? And I think that any elected official wakes up with that goal in mind, especially anybody who's at a state level position or a federal position, certainly. But at the party, again, it's just so easy to get caught up in all of the complaints and all of the criticisms. And it's not fun to have a decent proportion or decent fraction of that group hating you. So that's personally why I think that somebody would go the Action for Liberty route instead, just because it's easier. Like, it's the path of least resistance.
A year ago, let's talk about where we were a year ago.
Yeah.
A year ago, there was a Lincoln-Reagan dinner, and Donald Trump was the keynote speaker.
Yep.
Correct? And
Yeah,
members
yeah.
of the congressional delegation were there. Let's
They
fast
were all
forward.
there. Yep.
Let's fast forward to last week, and we had a Lincoln-Reagan dinner where none of the congressional delegation's members showed up, and I don't believe that the state leaders did too. And the narrative, which I think is accurate, is that there's division right now between the current party leadership and Action for Liberty, and because Action for Liberty, fairly say, I wouldn't call them liberty, or I wouldn't call them any type of authority on conservatism nor liberty in this state, but they have really gone after the current House leadership and the members of Congress in a way that I think is not only racist, sexist, inappropriate, but certainly not in any way value added to the Republican message or brand. I also don't consider them, the Action for Liberty, to be people who I would consider would play well in the sandbox with each other.
But that's not their goal, Michael. You have to remember that their only goal is to make money. Like,
correct.
They are running a basically nonprofit, and in my opinion, it's basically a grift. Like, their goal is to make money, and the way that they do that is by being inflammatory and by being clickbaity. And to say, hey, the Republican Party of Minnesota or this elected official did everything that they could, but we didn't get across the finish line because we're in a really tough environment, that's not sexy. That doesn't make money. And so in order to get those clicks, they just perpetuate the grift.
Yes.
That's their only goal. And so it's really sad to me when, yeah, a year ago, we did have President Donald Trump come. And it was really funny because that dinner was solely came about through relationships, right? That dinner came about because Chairman Han and I cultivated good relationships with people for many years. And there were people who were willing to bring and call in favors essentially to invite President Trump to Minnesota and get him here. And I shouldn't even say favors. That sounds scummy. Just say, hey, President Trump, we have a good relationship. Are you willing to come to Minnesota
Correct.
and help us out? Which, I mean, essentially a favor, whatever.
Yep.
But that came about through relationships. And it was funny when we announced that dinner. Of course, most people were like, yeah, this is great. Trump is coming. But then there were a handful of people who were like, Donald Trump this just isn't even all that great that he's coming. He's been here for so long, blah, 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 whatever. And it's, yeah, he's been around for 2015, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 21, 22, 23, 24. But only this final time did he come to Minnesota. And it's because of those relationships. And so I just think that's so important when you're trying to do anything, not even in politics, but just life in general, that you're maintaining relationships with people and you're actually trying to make lasting change.
You really touched on something that I was going to get to, but you brought it up in a much better way than I had sketched out, which is relationship building. One of the things that I find so frustrating is, and I saw this permeate out a little bit, which is expecting people having the expectation that if you attack people, that they're then going to do things for you. So for instance, Action for Liberty repeatedly goes after Congressman Emmer and other members of the congressional delegation. And then they have this podcast where they then kind of whine about the fact that the state party is having trouble financially, which we'll get into a little later. But the reality is that there's this expectation that Congressman Emmer or other members of the congressional delegation should give money to a state party who is aligned with a group that is taking such a hardline stance. That's basic interpersonal skills. That's basic relationship building. Successful politics is multiplication plus addition. Bad politics is division and subtraction. And it seems right now that the party and Action for Liberties, they're almost stuck in this mindset of, okay, we're going to go trash people. We're going to be difficult to people. We're going to go align with people that are difficult to members of Congress. And then we're simultaneously going to expect them to give money and build an operation. I think the contrast in what it happened last year, where thanks to good relationships, professional relationships, and a good rapport, the former president, then running for president, came to Minnesota and helped fundraise for the party at a critical time. That's successful to me. Why have we gone back rather than adopting that successful approach?
The funny thing though, and this is like what I just love about Action for Liberty, when Tom Emmer gave the party money and Stauber gave the party money and other people would give the party money, they're complaining. And they're like, how dare the party accept money from the rhinos in the swamp? And now they're like, the rhinos in the swamp aren't giving to the party. And it's just this constant flip-flopping. So truly, again, it's just the grift. It's what is going to make us the most money in today's fundraising email. And how can we say that somebody is doing something wrong and just poke somebody and say that they suck to literally make a quick buck? That's it. And that's their goal. The party's goal should be helping candidates, building local party units, supporting activists, right? That should be the goal of the party. Candidates and elected officials, your goal is to win, and everybody should be on that same track. But Action for Liberty is not on that track. They are there for themselves, and they're there to make money. That is it.
I remember where some of this really started from my vantage point, and you may have seen it, you probably saw it sooner because you were working as executive director, but are you hearing that noise?
No. What noise?
That's fine. Well, let's keep going. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I just muted myself while you're talking.
I'll deal with that. Don't worry. Just keep talking.
Okay.
Leave it on. During the 2024 race, I live in CD2. And one of the things I found very interesting was that Taylor Rahm was running for Congress in CD2. And a lot of his campaign's message was to attack Tom Emmer and this supposed swamp.
Tom
I
Emmer
would,
sucks. I suck. David sucks. Anybody who's ever worked for Tom sucks. Becky sucks. Yes.
and what was frustrating to me, and I remember saying this to representatives of Rahm's campaign, I'm like, look, you guys are spending more time beating up on Tom Emmer than you were on Angie Craig. And I was trying to understand from like a strategy standpoint what the purpose was in that. And then, of course, Rahm got endorsed. And then after the election, they tried to then raise money from the same people that they trashed. And guess what? It didn't work out. And I
Yeah.
think that kind of mindset, that's honestly where I think a lot of this generated from. And some of the same
Yeah.
people that are connected to Rahm are now at the state party. And so that mindset has carried over. And Action for Liberty, loving division and infighting, was
Right.
picked up on that message. And I'm trying to understand why Tom Emmer and members of the congressional delegation should give money and be expected to give money when people use them as a punching bag in campaigns. And I look back at that 2024 race where Taylor Rahm was running for the endorsement and then got it. He did so in large part by attacking Tom Emmer and the DC swamp more than he did, respectfully, Angie Craig. Not saying that Angie Craig
Right.
should be attacked all the time,
But
but
you
that's
shouldn't
the
say,
opponent.
you
That's the
shouldn't say
opponent.
she's dumb and ugly. That's not great. But you should say her policies are having a really bad impact on the families and businesses in CD2. That's a totally reasonable attack. I think that, though, Michael, this goes to a much deeper problem that we have in Republican politics in Minnesota currently, which is I think that a lot of people have just like lost hope and they just see us as this blue state. And so the Rahm or even people in City 2, they just have this mentality of we're never going to win the seat anyways. We're never going to beat Angie Craig anyways. So let's just go down fighting, or let's just stand for our principles, or let's just win the endorsement, or whatever it may be. And I do think, I don't know if you're planning to ask me later about the whole endorsement process, but I do think that we really need to take a hard look in the mirror as Republicans and say, okay, our goal in life as Republicans is not to win an endorsement. Our goal is to win the general election. And the endorsement should be one step of that. But if you're going to be like Taylor Rahm and you're going to spend the first, when did he get into the race? Like August of 23, maybe? It was like summer of 23. And then he spent summer of 23 all the way through April of 24 catering to the same 350 people, basically just talking about how conservative he was, how principled he was, what a great endorsed candidate he would be. And then all of a sudden he gets endorsed. And then a couple weeks later, a couple months later, whatever it was, he's out of the race because he can't raise any money. He's not being out in the district. He's not being active. He's not using a precinct strategy. And again, it's not just him. It's a lot of these candidates. You have to actually campaign outside of the endorsement. And I think that's one of the things that the DFL has on us. I think that they do an incredibly good job going to groups of people, meetings, events of non-delegates, non-caucus goers, just the general public, meeting people, being present, and reaching an audience that's bigger than just people who vote in an endorsement. But I really do think that's like a sickness in the Republican Party. I think we've just gotten to this very myopic view where we're just so set on the endorsement. And I think that it's because in a lot of ways, a lot of people have just like lost hope and they just don't think that change can be made. And then it just becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy, which is really sad and really toxic, especially from my point of view, because knowing what we're doing and then knowing what the DFL is doing, we're not checking the basic boxes of what needs to be done to win a campaign. And I wish that people could see that so that they could have hope and take heart and realize how much can be done and some of the very implementable changes that we could make so that we could start winning, even if that's not a statewide race right away. It could be a school board race in their community or a commissioner or say a House seat or a Senate seat. But I just think it's like this view of the endorsement has become our be all end all, and it's not. It literally does not. I don't know. People always say, when was the last time? You're like, whenever I push back on the endorsement, people are like, when was the last time that a non-endorsed candidate has won? And I'm like, when was the last time that an endorsed candidate has won? You can look at both sides of that coin.
I first got involved in the party in '94, and when I was a delegate to the '94 convention, I think it was an alternate, but it was there, technically an alternate. That was the year that sitting governor Arnie Carlson was challenged for the endorsement by Alan Quist. Carlson was not endorsed in '90. I mean, it was an odd dynamic, but he was seeking the party's endorsement in '94, did not get it. And there was talk back then when I first got involved about the needs to reform the party process, particularly when it comes to the endorsement. And I think something that I pinpointed to like the 2014 state convention. I was deputy chair during the 2010 governor's race. And I thought at that point, I mean, I was a party officer. It was my job to support the endorsement process, and we did a good job. But something changed, I think, in 2014. And what happened was that at that convention, which was Rochester, I was there, just reporting, wasn't there in any kind of official capacity. But candidates started to show up and give speeches that day. And they were successful in having a real impact on the convention. And what it showed was that and what's happened over the last now 10 plus years is that Republicans have looked at winning the endorsement as winning something significant. And the analogy that I've been using since 2014 still exists. Republican candidates think that if you win the endorsement convention, that there's some magical dump truck that shows up and drops a whole bunch of money and you leave the convention with a whole bunch of cash. It doesn't happen. There's no data to support that.
In some ways, that's true, right? Like in some ways, that's true. The party and the party units will spend some money on an endorsed candidate, but that should always be looked at as a supplement, whereas you need to be providing the bread and butter of your campaign. And I'm not saying that we should get rid of the endorsement or a candidate should forego the endorsement or anything like that. And I'm also not saying that they shouldn't. I'm just saying that if you're a candidate, I think that we really need to change the way that we look at the endorsement process, in that it can't be the only thing that you're doing. If you're spending
Correct.
5 nights a week from the summer, from when you announce all the way through the endorsing convention, and all that you're doing is going to 120 BPOU meetings and picnics and hog roasts and potlucks, you're doing it wrong. You need to be going to American Legions. You need to be going to the Hmong New Year Festival in St. Paul, just as one example. You need to be going to, I don't know why I'm blanking, like precinct level things. You need to be going to neighborhood night outs. Go to the fire department, pancake breakfast on a Saturday morning. There's so many events happening in our communities that we're just not at. And I just really fear that we've shrunk our circles down so much because, like you said, politics is a game of addition. And we do need more volunteers. We need more caucus participants. We need more small dollar donors. We need more staffers. We have a huge staff disparity in Minnesota. We need more people. We need more parade walkers. We need more door knockers. We need more people to make phone calls. We need more people to put a yard sign in their yard. And we just have not been making the effort to reach out to those people. So I guess just to segue and make one other point, if you don't mind, one of the jobs of the party, I believe, is to help do those things, right? It is to support the BPOUs, grow the BPOUs, train people, answer their questions. And usually it's not as if, and again, when I worked for Tom, I literally would go to several BPOU meetings every single month, largely to provide an update on what Tom was doing and answer questions about that. But then while I was there were always productive conversations and things that happened. Hey, we really want to do a mailing. How should we do it? Happy to help. Let's teach you how to use Data Center or whatever. And I was able to be a resource in a lot of ways for the BPOUs and for just the volunteers, the activists, down ticket candidates, things like that. And I think that as a whole, the party should be doing a lot more of that. One of the really sad things to me about David losing is that we had people lined up from the Trump campaign to start doing that for our BPOUs, like essentially being customer service reps for every CD, for the BPOUs, people who had relationships before, people who had been trained in the Trump program that had been so successful. Even though we didn't win Minnesota, he still won every single swing state. So it was a very good program. And I know you're not a fan of Trump, but they certainly pulled off like a huge W there. So I don't want to hear any arguments on that one. But people who would just have been able to go to the BPOUs and be a resource and support people and talk about those goals. And the reason that it hadn't been done before was because the party was in debt for way before David or I ever got there. And so, again, I just think it's hard when you lose overall to actually see these smaller points of progress and like tangible things that can be done. And again, that just feeds into the discouragement loop, which then leads to turnover and all of the wonkiness that we see.
Is the endorsement process broken, or the emphasis that people put on the endorsement process too much?
I think that candidates get a myopic view and forget to win the general, and they focus too much on the endorsement. That's what I would say. That's what I would say. Like, the endorsement is a thing, right? Like, it's an inanimate thing. Like, you as the person You control the destiny of your own destiny of how you use that thing. So for example, like Scott Jensen, I know you've had a lot of like really honest conversations with Scott Jensen and talked to him about how he maybe did some things that didn't help him win the general. But one of the things that Scott Jensen did really was he turned out a lot of people to caucus, meaning that he played that addition game and he brought a lot of
Correct.
people in. And that's why he won the endorsement. And so I don't want to comment on anything that Scott Jensen did like post endorsement.
Got it.
But up to the endorsement, he did a very good job of using the endorsement to bring more people into the fold, recruit volunteers, recruit small dollar donors, and then he had this giant pool of people to use going forward into the general. So again, could Scott Jensen have done an even better job of focusing less on the endorsement? 100%. And I'm not saying everything he did was perfect or not perfect or whatever, but I think that as far as how it should go, that's one of the better examples that I've seen, at least in recent years, for using the endorsement. I've also seen, though, Minnesota's not the only state that I've worked in. I've also seen candidates win primaries where they just come in and mommy and daddy have a bunch of money, and that's how they win a primary. And I think that produces a trash candidate as well, when they just know a bunch of rich people who then fund their existence. That's garbage. We don't want that. So I'm not an advocate for getting rid of the endorsement, but gosh darn it, if candidates want to win, they really need to start taking a very different approach when it comes to the endorsement. And they cannot get this, is myopic the right word? I don't know. It's just like this weird focus on the endorsement. You have to work outside of the existing 14,000 people who caucused 2 years ago.
I really liked your answer because I probably would have said, dump the endorsement. But the way you answered it and the insights that you had about Jensen makes a lot of sense. In that scenario, as you described, which I think is factually accurate, he invested in the endorsement process. He got people to attend their caucuses. He fully invested in it. Now, here's where two distinctions I want to make on that. How much money are you spending to get those people to show up for the endorsement process?
Right.
Are they spending too much money? But on the flip side, I think my concern, and I think you've helped provide some context and help me understand it a little better more what's currently going on. My larger concern was people just like showing up the day of the convention, getting a speech, and they get 20, 30%, and they throw the convention into chaos. There are some candidates.
Yeah.
There are some candidates who should not, and one of the reforms I think should be made is the caliber of candidates that are going up there and speaking, and can they run? I think that, and this is something I'll go back to when I was deputy chair. I remember saying to the campaigns, and it was Emmer's gubernatorial campaign and Marty Seifert's gubernatorial campaign, I remember saying to them, remember there's a general election. You have to be, remember we got to come out of this convention and not just win an endorsement, but there is some, and so I think that perspective that you're offering of candidates investing, getting people to turn out. I think my concern is the candidates that show up that get through the process. Their campaigns are in no financial situation to win. They're not viable, but for some reason the party feels an obligation. We should let this person speak. And I guess my follow-up question to you is, if you don't get rid of the endorsement process, should there not be some measures in place so the candidates that are speaking, like they've raised money, they're in a position to win, they're not just starting their campaign that way? Should there not be, is the job of the party not to help provide some of those metrics and information? And should the party's endorsement process at least be reformed in terms of the qualifications to seek and speak at a convention?
Yeah, that's one of my big regrets from the 2024 state convention. And I got a lot of complaints afterwards. So you get the complaints from people saying, you're being too authoritarian, whatever. And then you get complaints from people who are like, yeah, I wish that you would have given me more information because I didn't have enough to vote on. And
let me pause for a second. I want to just say something. You're hitting on something that I want to validate for our listeners. One of the smartest things someone told me after I became deputy chair was that roughly 30% of the activists will not like you just because you're the incumbent. And the same goes to staff.
It's more.
And so staff is on the receiving end. And so I just want to acknowledge that that staff and party officers get a high percentage of complaints just because it's just an unhappy process for a lot of people. So please continue.
But back to your very first question, though, Michael, of why do people side with Action for Liberty? It is so exhausting, and I don't want to sound like I'm whining, but like it is so exhausting to be the executive director and just have people complaining at you every single day. And people
Correct.
complain about everything. Hey, I saw a yard sign and it wasn't propped up all the way on some random highway 5 hours from here. Can't the party do a better job getting their yard signs put up? Or, hey, you sent me an email and you didn't respond to it. And I'm sorry, you're correct. I didn't respond to it, but I don't think that makes me a demon. Or, hey, we're not getting enough support here. Just like literally anything. And so I do sympathize with anybody who works for the party, because it is really hard to just constantly have this like barrage of complaints. And by the way, I'm sure that the Democrats get it too. I'm sure that every Republican and Democrat rep, like they have somebody dedicated to just answer the phone and take complaints all day, every day. But emotionally, it is so much easier to just side with Action for Liberty, stop a lot of the complaints, and have some peace.
Correct.
So I think that's part of it too. Like, it's not fun to do things that you just know are going to generate more complaints. But back to what were you asking about the endorsement?
I was asking, I wanted to say if one of the reforms for the endorsement.
Oh, yes. So, yes, got a lot of complaints from people. Why didn't we know this? Why didn't we know that? And so then one of the things that we did for the state central meeting in December is the state exec board actually used their abilities that they have within the Constitution and bylaws to put out some very basic, generic parameters for people who wanted to run for party office. And I really don't think that's the worst idea for the state convention either. But you have to remember that body can vote to overrule anything. And so the best way, the easiest way, the quickest way, which isn't easy or quick at all, to make reforms on a statewide level within the party is to get enough people to caucus so that you can have enough voters on the floor to put through what needs to be put through. And if that doesn't happen, I just think it's very difficult. But ultimately, I do think that the candidates play a part in that. Does the party play a part? Absolutely. But I also think that the candidates play a part. Just going back to Jensen for a minute, so two things that stick out to me about Jensen, and this is just examples of things he did. And again, I'm not saying he did everything right or I
understand.
love him or anything, but personally, I actually do really like him. I think he's a great guy. But so fall of 2021, my BPOU had 3 candidates running for school board. And we all got together one Sunday afternoon at Walgreens and we like printed some lit for them. And I showed up early to try to explain to everybody how to use the app and whatnot. And this mom shows up with these 2 teenage girls. And I'm like saying hi to the mom and I say hi to the girls. And I'm like, oh, hi girls. I'm like, it's so nice of you to come door knocking with your mom today. Like, what a good sport for you to be here as teenagers to door knock. And they're like, oh, we made her come door knocking with us because we saw Scott Jensen on TikTok. And my mind was just blown. I was like, oh my gosh, like a Republican candidate who has managed to excite teenagers enough to come out to a Walgreens parking lot at 1 p.m. on a Sunday when every other teenager is probably in bed sleeping, but to door knock. And then a couple weeks later, I was visiting my sister at her college dorm when she moved in, and one of her little friends in their room on their bulletin board in their dorm, they have a Scott Jensen flyer. And I was like, oh, what's this? And this college kid is telling me how much they love Scott Jensen. So I think that's the type of energy and that's the type of outreach that we need to do to bring people into the caucuses to then go through the process to reform it. If that makes sense.
If I'm understanding you correctly, and by the way, really insightful, because you've in some ways reframed my thinking and how I describe this a little bit, because what in essence you're saying is investing in it differently rather where candidates are using Jensen as an example of someone who went through the party process. He got people to show up and balance that. The question, and I think that's really interesting. I think that's just fascinating. And I think that's the type of perspective that I'm really fascinated by that, because I had not thought about it that way. And it's just fascinating to hear you describe it that way, because that makes total sense.
And one other thing to say too, as the ED of the state party, the state convention really is your Super Bowl.
Yep.
As the party, our job is to be the administrator and the operations manager of the endorsement process, of the conventions, all of those things. So for example, my life was absolutely just insanely busy up through May 17th of last year. And then it actually slowed down a little bit because then the candidates took over and a lot of our administrative functions were done. So as a party person, the endorsement really is your focus, right? That was huge for us. But as a candidate, the endorsement shouldn't be your focus, even though it is a big event. And so it's, again, I can't stress enough. If I were a candidate tomorrow, you should use the endorsement. Don't let the endorsement use you. It's an inanimate thing. And at the end of the day, you have control over how much effort and time and money you sink into it.
I have to say, this is just another example of why I love doing podcasts, because I was pretty set in my ways about this. And it's really interesting to hear you describe it, because it really is making me rethink how I would view the endorsement process.
Yeah.
And I think you've offered, it's just really fascinating to have someone who knows in relevant times, in relevant things, how the endorsement process should be used in a beneficial way. And I haven't heard it articulated like that. And so, boy, it really shows the depth of your knowledge. I had just not thought about it from that perspective. I would have taken it from the standpoint of ignore it, move on. But you're talking about it from the standpoint of investing in the right way and working within the system. It's really insightful.
If, again, maybe a candidate is going to decide that they're not going to go through the endorsement process. Dennis Smith, a few years ago, he was going to BPOU meetings, he was going through the endorsement process, but he openly said to people, hey, I'd be honored to have your endorsement, but if I don't get it, I'm going to the primary. And so again, he had this bigger view, right? And he was doing a lot of unconventional things to reach out to voters who weren't already in the caucus system. But one other thing that I'd like to just say about the endorsement process is I do think that the grassroots are important, and I do think that the party faithful should get a voice and a vote. And one of my favorite stories to tell is from when I was in Kansas in 2022, when a large group of very conservative Republicans blew the governor's race for Derek Schmidt because they thought that he wasn't conservative enough. So in 2018, Chris Kobach, who everybody knows is this blood red, flame-throwing, cowboy boot-wearing Kansan Republican, he ran for... Yeah, you wish. He ran for governor against Laura Kelly, and he lost in 2018, big blue wave.
So not like you,
yeah. 4 years later, Chris Kobach decided to run for attorney general. Laura Kelly ran for governor. Chris Kobach got more votes for AG than Laura Kelly had gotten 4 years ago. And then Derek Schmidt, the gubernatorial candidate, he lost to Laura Kelly. And there was a fourth party candidate, so not your typical third party candidate, but a fourth party one that a lot of the Republicans had written in and petitioned to get on the ballot, who got the exact same number of votes that was the delta between Schmidt and Kelly, which was also how many more votes Kobach had gotten than Derek Schmidt. And so I do think that situation is one of just the most, I don't want to swear on your podcast, but good Lord, what a disaster. One of the most messed up situations that I think may ever occur in a gubernatorial race, because it was so avoidable and just such a nightmare. But I do think that's an example of what can happen when the grassroots don't have a say. Because down there, it's literally just a primary and they have 5-party units. It's 4 congressional district boards and a state thing. So I do think it's important to include people and give people a voice earlier in the process, if not to prevent some of the disassociations that come when people don't feel like they're a part of it or when they're heard. So I'm not saying that the endorsement is bad. I'm not saying get rid of it. It's a lost cause. It's hopeless. I'm just saying that if you're a candidate and you're going to go through the endorsement, just be very careful that you remember that there's a general election and that the endorsement is one step along the way.
Let me ask you a pointed question a bit. One of my frustrations about the endorsement process is the belief that the delegates to the party process are really kicking the tires in the right way about the candidates. That's one of my frustrations.
It's so frustrating.
And I don't believe that's what's going on.
It's so frustrating to walk out of that state convention and have people say 3 months down the road or even a month down the road, you didn't tell me XYZ about Royce White, or you didn't tell me XYZ about so-and-so. And it's you are literally sitting there at the convention with your phone. Go to twitter.com, type in @highway_30 and start reading his tweets. Read Joe Frazier's tweets. Look people up. It's at your fingertips. You have no excuse not to look this stuff up. And the thing that especially kills me is when these people are like twice my age and they're complaining about how, oh, political staffers don't have enough real world experience or whatever. And it's like, you're a full-fledged adult. Like, you could look this stuff up just as easily as I can. There's no secrets that I know about candidates. I guess that's not true. I guess that when you're working with people behind the scenes, you do learn a little bit more about them. But there's no like huge crazy things that I know about a candidate that you can't look up by calling them on the phone, because every candidate is willing to take a phone call from a delegate because they want their vote. And you can go look them up online. Look at their website. Look at the FEC. All of that stuff is public information. So I will say, yes, the party definitely has a responsibility. And again, I could have done many things differently at that 2024 convention. That was like the first one that I had actually been in charge of where I was the ED. And I do have a lot of regrets. And if I were to do it again, had David won, there are a lot of things I would have done differently. But the delegates absolutely do have a responsibility. And when I'm a delegate or a voter, I do look into stuff, and I also guess I don't necessarily just trust somebody else to give me. If I respect somebody, I'll want their opinion, but I want to look into it for myself. I don't just want what's only being given to me by the party.
Sure. I want to share one historical kind of point for context. I remember when I was the deputy chair, and there was discussion on list agreements and candidates that were seeking the endorsement who would discuss the possibility of running in the primary. I remember having a conversation with the staffer, I'll name her Gina Countryman, having a conversation with her because my position as deputy chair was they're not going to abide by the endorsement. We shouldn't let them speak to the convention then if they're not going to abide by the endorsement. And she pushed back, and it really was just a moment that I'll always remember. She said, that's a question for the body. And what I learned from that conversation is her point was, she was given some advice and saying, look, the job of the party should be to present the candidates, to delegate to the body, let the delegates decide, inform the delegates of that decision, give them more options, not less. I completely agree with her perspective, and it makes sense. On the flip side, is there a role for the party to prevent candidates who are simply unqualified, will be a drag on the ticket, and will cause internal strife from seeking and being allowed to get the endorsement?
I think the internal strife piece is pretty subjective, but I don't think it's crazy to say, hey, a serious candidate at May of an election year will have raised X number of dollars, will have recruited X number of volunteers, will have been to X number of events, will not have done this basic list of inflammatory things. But again, I don't think it's the worst idea to kick it to the body. I think the problem comes when the body then 3 months later yells at you when they realize that you didn't give them enough information or the right information or the information that they wanted or what have you. And it's also a problem when that body of people is only being grown by Action for Liberty. When Action for Liberty is the only organization out there that's doing caucus training and recruiting and bringing people into the fold in that regard. Again, not even to help candidates down the line, but to express their frustrations in the party, that's a big problem. And one of the gentle nudges that I would give to elected officials and our congressionals and everybody else is that we need to do a better job of growing that caucus base and bringing more people into the party and recruiting volunteers and activists and getting people to those programs. It can't just be this thing where everybody abandons ship because we're having a tough time with endorsements.
Let me ask you a question. Do you think Republicans like me are part of the problem?
I think in some ways. I think that once you get like a candidate or like an endorsed candidate, I think that you just got to get behind them. There are so many people who are like, I can't believe as the party you're getting behind Royce. And that's literally my job. He got endorsed. I don't have an option here and my feelings don't matter. This is my job. And so I do think that like the detracting constantly is a problem. I would also say, Michael, you have a voice. You're a person. You could show up at caucus and make your voice heard. You could bring a friend. You could make your spouse and your kids caucus. And then boom, that's 5 votes right there. So I think
that's kind of what I was referring to.
There are ways for people to get involved. And I think that, again, when you only have, I think last time around we had 13 or 14,000 people caucus. That's not like a representative sample of the average Minnesota voter or even the average Republican in Minnesota.
So do you think Republicans like me need to get more involved in the party process and
Yeah, 100%. I think you should caucus. I think Becky should caucus. I think every single person should caucus. I think I tell all my friends every year, I'm like, can you caucus? Can you caucus? And usually the answer is no. Occasionally you'll get somebody, to join in. But any single person who like complains about the party or is unhappy about the party or doesn't like Action for Liberty or didn't like Royce White or didn't like Joe Frazier or whatever it is, the way to fix that is to get your butt to caucus and to spend a few Saturdays going through the process. And I just always tell people, and I'll say this to you, Michael, if you can't sit through one night of caucus, a BPOU convention, a CD convention, and a state convention, then I don't want to hear your complaints. Get involved, do the work, and if it's not worth it to you, if it's not worth that much effort and that's just too much, then stop complaining about it. Sorry.
So let's continue this exercise, which is going very well. Push back a bit. My frustration with the party process is that I don't know how interested a lot of the Republicans are in trying to win. That's my frustration. And I believe in the art of the possible, and I understand that compromise is a part of politics. It's the truest form is some art of compromise. But my frustration in going is that I don't know how many activists want to win and understand what it takes to win. Is that wrong of me? Am I wrong? Or so that's somewhat what fuels my desire not to go. Pushback, am I wrong?
So yes, if you live in CD2, which is just it's a rough district. So yeah, if you went to caucus, I'm assuming a lot of people would be really mean to you. Like it would not be a fun night for you. It would not be a fun night for a lot of other people, but I don't think that we should just say,
I really appreciate that.
But I don't think that we can say this isn't fun, we don't want to do it. But yeah, so I get why people don't want to do it. I totally get it. But on the other side of that, it's like you have to do it. I just got so frustrated too. One of the things that we even did, so we did a lot of work on the caucus process. And one of the things that we tried to, I don't want to say codify, but like we did put in writing was if people wanted to caucus and they couldn't make it. So you can still get voted in as a delegate, even if you can't go to caucus. And that's pretty easy. If all you have to do is fill out a form, take a picture of it with your phone and snap it in to your BPOU leader to get your name on the ballot on caucus night to become a delegate. It's just really frustrating to me when people don't participate and then they complain about the way that the party is going or what candidates get endorsed or things like that. And there are so many people who I think, like you, are just fed up with the nonsense and the bullshit, and they just don't want to waste their time doing it, essentially. But like I said, if you don't go, if you can't spend those 3 weekends in caucus night doing that, things just aren't going to get better.
So basically your message to me is put up or shut up.
Yeah, that's my message to a lot of people. That's my message too, and again, I would have never said this when I was the sitting ED. A lot of these, even legislators and candidates as well, it's like you really have to actively be working on your base. You need to be making a list of who's going to come to caucus and who are my delegates going to be out of every single precinct. And you're going to have to call friends and family, and you're going to have to tap people from church and tap people from your gun club and tap people from work and tap your kids' friends and anybody that you know to come and participate in this process, because it's always changing, it's always dynamic, it's always fluid. And unless it's totally stagnant, which I would argue is unhealthy, you're always going to be needing new blood, and you're always going to be needing more supporters, more small donors, more volunteers, things like that. So I do think that overall there does need to be a bigger effort. And again, I think that really does start with the low-hanging fruit with people like you. And I'd say, Michael, there's a lot of other people like you, even proximally to the party, who are Republicans. Every single person who works on a nonprofit or does an IE, every single staffer should go to caucus. Every single person who works for Americans for Prosperity should go to caucus. Every single person who, I know a lot of conservative people at the Minnesota Business Council, they should all be at caucus. There's so many entities that could help push people in that direction, and we just haven't done a good job with it. And so in a way, it's almost our fault that we're having this problem.
But what I think what you're saying is that shouldn't excuse me from my responsibility of participating in the party process if I'm going to go out and be a critic.
Yeah. Yeah. Yep.
I
Yep.
wasn't expecting a lecture today, but thank you.
I just think that if it is worth your time to complain about it and you believe that you are right, do something about it. Again, 3 weekends and a caucus night. It's not an insurmountable problem. Like, your voice can make a difference, and this is not just like this hopeless thing that we all have fallen victim to and there's nothing we can do about it. There are steps that can be taken.
I give you credit for pushing back. I give you a lot of credit. I give you a lot of credit for saying that to me. And I'll guarantee I'll take it to heart. I wasn't expecting that, but I'm going to take it to heart because it's something that I've said to myself of, don't I have a response? If I'm going to go out and opine and offer analysis, shouldn't I get involved more to at least try to fix it? And not because, as I've said before, in 2024, Royce White didn't break the rules. He didn't break the rules to get endorsed. He won that endorsement fair and square, and it was people like me who have gotten, I think, as you pointed out, I think too complacent and unwilling to give even a modicum of time to the party process and need to look themselves in the mirror and say, if you're going to be so critical of a process, you have opportunities to reform it. Now,
and I don't know how much you want to get into the whole Royce White thing with that 2024 convention, but Royce actually did his work. He actually sent me a list of the people that were coming into the convention to volunteer for him on time. They actually bought their tickets on time. They put disclaimers on their signs. They had a whole team there to hand out signs, to hand out shirts. They had people checking other people in. Like, he had a point person who I was working with, and they did the work at that convention to get that endorsement. Now, this was nowhere near the scale that like Scott Jensen did, but everyone's, oh my gosh, how did Royce win? It's like he actually showed up and did some pretty basic work that his competition didn't do.
Now, and I consider myself a Republican, but one area where I had some disagreement this past election cycle was I was a Republican for Harrison Walz and didn't support Donald Trump. Give some pushback. Where do you think I got that wrong? And what do you see about Trump and his presidency and the current Republicans in office that I may be missing?
So have I ever told you how I became a fan of Donald Trump? Have we ever talked about that?
No.
Okay. So back in 2015, when all the rumors about Trump like running for president started and he came down the escalator and that whole thing took off, I am obviously very religious, very conservative, a Republican, but like I'm also very socially conservative, right? And so I like had I didn't dislike Trump, but I just had a lot of little suspicions about him because he's like a New York socialite, basically. Like, he's not this like social evangelical conservative that a lot of the voters who vote for him are. But in February of 2016, one of my very liberal college professors led a trip to the Iowa caucuses. And at that point, I was still like pretty suspicious of Trump of, oh, can he win? Is he the guy? Whatever. And again, I was like in college, so I had nowhere near the knowledge of politics that I do now. But at the Iowa caucuses, all the candidates are there. And so like I had the opportunity to hear Marco Rubio speak and shake his hand. And I heard Ted Cruz speak and I shook his hand, and I heard Carly Fiorina speak and I shook her hand. And I just remember like standing there and I just got nothing from any of those people. Like, they were all just, I'm not saying that they're duds, but like I met them in person, seeing their stump speeches, I was like, yeah, they just don't have it. They just don't have the it factor. And in my head, February of 2016, and in my gut, I was like, I think it's going to be Donald Trump because he's bold, and I think that he brings people to him. And so I think that you need a candidate like that if you're going to turn people out. And I know last time I was on some podcast, maybe you, maybe somebody else, I don't know, we were talking about the turnout game a lot. But I do think that Trump is just magnetic, and I think that people are drawn to him. And I think that's a really important quality to have in a candidate. And the guy won all 7 swing states. Like, as I said a little bit ago, like that's no small feat to pull off. But I do think that you need a candidate who can inspire people and turn them out. And whether or not you think that Donald Trump is perfect or you love him, which again, I don't think he's perfect. I don't think any candidate is ever going to be perfect. I wish that voters knew enough to know that you're never going to find the perfect candidate. But I think that, Michael, I think that you just miss that like magnetism and the turnout effect and the inspiration and the courage and the boldness that brings people in. So yeah, I know a lot of like diehard Trump fans didn't always 100%. They weren't like always Trump fans. And I would say I'm in that boat. And I don't know. I guess I still have hope that you'll come around at some point. Like I wouldn't put money on it, but I just think that there is something about him that is really attractive to people.
What do you think? What do you like about this term that he's in, his second term, but there was a break, obviously.
Yeah.
What do you see going on right now that you identify with and think he's crushing it?
I think the gloves are off. I think that every single like gut instinct that he didn't listen to in his first term and then in his second campaign, I think that he's just going with his gut. I also think though that it's important to note that he has a lot of really good people surrounding him to the point where in his first campaign and even his second campaign, he didn't have that same like industrial like ring around him. And I also think it's important to note that they ran a completely different campaign in 2024 than they did in 2020 or even in 2016. So he really has learned from what he's done, like what not to do in order to be successful. But I think that the comms have gotten more proactive. I think that his hires have been really good. And I think that he just has a better understanding this time as well of what actually needs to be done on the official side. Like, and this is for anybody on either side of the aisle. I just could not imagine becoming president and having to fill the entire federal government with staffers or be putting press releases out about what you're doing or running that ship. But I will say, I do think that he's learned, and I think that it is a much more bold term, but in some ways, though, it's a little bit more conventional just with how they're doing it. Like they're using the system to their advantage. And I think that they've learned that from the past 2 times.
Push back again, but I'd ask about Trump specifically in Minnesota. What evidence did you see in the
Yeah.
past election cycle about Trump's brand in Minnesota?
So that I guess that is one thing that I will say. The Trump brand obviously works great nationally, right? Like when you win all 7 swing states, you're doing something right. But I think that Minnesota, we're just very different. Like in 2016, weren't we the only state to go for Rubio? We're just weird. I think Minnesota conservatives have just been weird for a really long time. And so I would say that even if Trump doesn't win Minnesota, there is still an energizing factor among the base, the grassroots, Republican voters when it comes to Trump. And I think that the tricky part is that you want to find a candidate who's not as off-putting as Trump is to the average Minnesotan, but you also need somebody who can inspire the turnout that Trump inspires, because turnout is such a big part of winning, right? It's not like we know exactly the same people who are going to show up to vote every single time. Like who shows up is it varies. Yes, I would also argue though too, like I know that you've consistently said Trump does not win in Minnesota, and that's a factual statement. We've now had 3 times where Trump has not won in Minnesota. But I don't think that means that he shouldn't be then the fit for the country, if that makes sense. I don't want
No,
to
it does.
get too myopic of a view of what's good for Minnesota. Sometimes something that's good for the whole country is not necessarily going to be good for Republicans in one pocket. But even when he came to town, I mean, that Lincoln Reagan dinner, at least in like recent history, was a wild success. Jam packed, sold out. We raised almost $1 million. So he's still well loved here
How many people
among the
attended that
base.
event, you think?
I don't know. And I don't know. I would need to look back at the numbers, but I want to say so the whole upper ballroom of the River Center seated like over 1,000 people. And it sold out. I'd have to look back at exactly the floor charts, but it was a lot of people. It was a lot of people.
One thing that I will note that I was wrong about in the last election cycle was, and I remember discussing this, one of the challenges I had with Trump was that I always had a concern about him being value added to the rest of the ticket. And when he came in for the Lincoln Reagan dinner, Becky and I did a show, and we had some people on who talked about how Trump was being value added. And it's pretty
Right.
clear based on the election results the fact that Trump won, the Republicans won the House, they won the Senate, and they won the presidency, and they control all branches of government. They control both houses of Congress and the presidency. That was a sizable and dominating win that he had the last election cycle. To me, that shows that there was synergy on the rest of the ticket between Trump and other campaigns that ran. And in fact, in Minnesota, Republicans did win control, did tie, did win control temporarily, and now have a tie in the Minnesota House, which was an election gain that you and Chairman Hand can take under your belts as a win. And to me, that's another example of how, aside from Trump's brand might be bad in Minnesota, but there is a uniting effect that he has, that energy that you're referring to that does shape up. Am I correct in that kind of making that analysis?
Well, and part of the good thing too about Trump is that because he is so popular nationwide, because he does raise so much money and he has this swell behind him, he is able to pour into bluer states like Minnesota or a state party. It's just always going to be harder in bluer states, right? So he's able to pour into a state party like Minnesota, or I know his campaign was very helpful to the Colorado state party as well. And so when you get this momentum where, again, I don't know what would have happened had Nikki Haley run. Like, I really don't know. Or another candidate, DeSantis or something. But I don't think that any of them would have just gotten the volume of momentum and funds and volunteers and everything that Trump did. And the nice thing is that if you are willing to be selfless and let that spill over to help in other areas, it truly does help, right? Like, it helps the congressionals here, it will help a governor's race, it will help a Senate race, it will help the legislature, all of those things. And I think too, from 2015 to 2024, the president has built so many relationships with people. He's not really a newcomer anymore, but he's been there for 10 years, almost. So I will say that there have been a lot of really good fruits that have come from the Trump campaign, and then also just the win this third time around.
Correct. And I think what this shows, to close out this subject, is that what it shows is relationships matter. It was incredibly valuable. One of the things that the candidates have, one of the most valuable things that the candidates have when they're running for office, and whether you're a Democrat or Republican candidate running for president, it's time. And in 2024, Donald Trump invested in coming to Minnesota and worked in a collaborative way to help fund and build the party's operations. And since taking office, that relationship has deteriorated, and we're not seeing that same level of cooperation at the congressional level or with the Trump campaign. And ultimately, that relationship needs to improve I think, for Republicans to succeed and get what you talk about, that energy and synergy coming into 2026. And I think that's a benchmark that the current party administration needs to take note of and work to improve.
Yeah, and in addition to the relationships do matter, but also you need a candidate who can attract momentum and attract support and raise funds as well. There is an it factor when it comes to candidates, and had Trump not had that it factor, had he not been doing so well, he wouldn't have been able to spare a weekend to come to Minnesota, right? Like, when you're able to do so well, you get these surpluses that you can then burn off in other places.
We're coming into an election cycle next year where there's going to be some unique things here. We're going to have an open seat in CD2. We're going to have an open U.S. Senate seat. And Governor Walz has not announced what he's doing in terms of re-election, although I think most people think he's going to run. Give your lay of the land of where you think there are opportunities for Republicans in 2026. And then also dovetail that into what needs to happen with this dynamic between the state party, the congressionals, and A4L for everyone to get on the same page so there can be successes for Republicans in Minnesota in 2026.
To be honest, I don't know if in the next year, decades of interpersonal conflicts can be healed and if everybody can get on the same page.
I would agree with you.
But if I were a candidate, I would just try to stay out of all of that. And I would start raising money, and I would start playing the addition game and bringing people in. And if I wanted to go for the endorsement, I would start recruiting for caucus. And I think that if people do those things, just check the basic boxes, I think that there is opportunity for any of those offices. One of the most shocking things to me was that after Walz was picked as the VP, we had people walking into our office at the party saying, oh my gosh, I knew that Walz was bad, but I didn't know XYZ about him, or I didn't know this about him, or I didn't know that about him. And again, these are Republicans who are taking time out of their day to come into our office. So these are not uninformed voters or apathetic voters, right? And so I do think that if Walz runs again, I do think that there is a lot of room for a candidate to capitalize on the national campaign that was launched against him. In terms of the Senate seat, it's going to be open. That's a good opportunity. But I think that it will just take a candidate doing the right things, checking the basic boxes, building a good team, and just trying to stay above everything that's going on. Because at the end of the day, all of the people fighting are at most 2,200 voters in a state of 3.5 million voters. It's just such a tiny pool of people. Action for Liberty, I don't know what happened with their court case exactly, but the judge basically ruled that like their list was so small that it wasn't worth anything, so that when they were giving it away for free, it like didn't count as a trackable contribution or whatever, because it was just tiny. And again, that's not, look it up, that's not word for word, but that's basically like the essence of it. To say they don't have a huge impact, right? So they might kick and scream and shout over here, and the party might cause a bunch of problems with that dynamic, but it's not like it's not like essential to like winning a general election. It's 2,200 people at most who are in this delegate pool.
And I have to say something that I was not expecting. You have given me, first of all, I think you're incredibly talented and smart, but your perspective, particularly on the endorsement, is really going to ring inside my head for the next few days, because it really is just insightful and an approach I had not been articulated to me before. And I think your approach really makes sense. I think what I'm hearing from you, and correct me if I'm wrong, is advocacy of the endorsement process. Have people invest in it. The best way to have the system work better is to invest in it, to work within the system, not just avoid it, but to invest in it. And I also think your message to me a bit was, Michael, if you're going to complain, show up to conventions and invest in the party. It seemed, I was really I'm just very thoughtful. And it really shows, I think, your grounded knowledge in what the party is, unfortunately, where the party is right now, where it's been, but where it can certainly go. And that's a really important message, particularly for someone like me, who considers themselves a Republican, but wants a vibrant two-party system. I think for the first time, I'm hearing from someone who's saying, Michael, here's how someone like you who can do it, and others, how you need to work alongside people. I think it was really an impactful interview. And boy, I'm going to be thinking a lot about this over the next few days.
I'm glad. I hope that you caucus and encourage other people to caucus, and I hope that a lot of other people caucus too, not just you. But at the end of the day, a system is a system. Like, it's an inanimate thing that we get to choose how we use it. Don't be a victim of an inanimate thing.
Yep. And I appreciate the first lecture I've gotten on the breakdown with Brodkorb and Becky. I really appreciate it. But I know it came from a good spot, but well received, message received. And I thank you so much for joining me today.
No, thank you for having me. It was good to see you, and yeah, appreciate it.
We'll have you back soon.
Thanks, Michael.
I want to thank you for listening to this episode of The Breakdown with Brodkorb and Becky. We know you have a lot of podcast options out there, and we're truly grateful you choose to spend time with us. Before you go, show some love for your favorite podcast by leaving us a review on Apple Podcasts or on the platform where you listen. You can also follow us across our website and across all social media platforms at BBBreakPod. The Breakdown with Brodkorb and Becky will be back next week. Until then, thank you for tuning in. We appreciate you flying with us through this world of politics and current affairs. Have a great weekend.